In this lesson, we're going to learn how to set up two render layers, both of them ambient occlusion. One for just the ambient occlusion of our sign, and another for the ambient occlusion of our ground. So here's where we left off, and you can open up 08_end. So we set up our color pass, so now let's continue on and build our occlusion passes. So again, we want to create a new layer, and let's call this AO, and I'm going to do an underscore sign, so this is my ambient occlusion of my sign. Just the sign. So let's set this up first. So again, in our color pass, we'll need the sign group. So I'm just hitting up to get to the top of my hierarchy to select my sign group. Let's go into the AO sign and let's add selected objects. Now for the ambient occlusion to work correctly on these support brackets here, we're going to need to add in our ground. So let's go back to our master layer, select our ground. Let's go into the AO sign layer and again add selected objects. And now we'll be able to create a material override. So let's right click on this AO sign, and it's going to be actually below the viewership or the camera settings here. As you can see, it's right on the edge of my screen. So we can go again. So we cannot really get around that. So on this layer, I'm just going to right click it and let's go to overrides. And then near the bottom, there's a create new material override. And once we hover over that, we'll get a list of our materials, and let's create a new material override of a surface shader. And that's going to copy our new surface shader 2 onto everything. So let's just call this our ambient occlusion material, or AO mat. And to set this up, we're going to need to do a few things for our out color. Let's create a new render node. Jump over to the mental ray tab. And let's scroll down until we get to the fast ambient occlusion, or the MIB fast occlusion node. Let's click on this, and this will set up our fast occlusion. So let's bump up our samples to something like 32, which will give us a nice even spread. And if we render this right now, we're not actually going to get anything. We first need to go into our render globals, go to the features tab, and turn on ambient occlusion. So this is pretty important because we're not going to be able to see anything until we turn this checkbox on. So remember, that's under our render settings, features, ambient occlusion. Okay, so let's check this out and see what options we need to tweak. So here is the base ambient occlusion, and as you can see, it's a little bit too strong and too spread out, probably because our scene size is very small. And we're still getting ground occlusion. So let's deal with the first issue, and that is going to be inside of our fast occlusion. So let's bump up the spread to about 0.8, and this will give us a nice even spread on our image. Now you'll notice that the occlusion is going everywhere. Our sign has occlusion on it, when really it should be focused on the areas that are essentially touching or very close to other geometry. So to fix this, we can increase the max distance and sort of give our ambient occlusion a cutoff. I'm going to try the value of 1 and see how that looks. Of course, we need to render this, and then we can increase it or decrease it depending on how strong and how sharp of an occlusion result we want. And I'm actually pretty happy with this. It looks like we've got a nice, sharp occlusion on our image. It looks like the bags are being occluded nicely. And we're not getting any of that occlusion spill we were getting earlier on our sign. Getting a little nice occlusion here, and so this looks actually pretty good. So now let's figure out how we can remove the occlusion on the ground here. And we can do that in quite a few different ways, actually. The way I prefer to do it is let's select our ground geometry here. Let's go into our attribute editor, and under our shape node, under the mental ray tab, actually under our render stats, I should say, we have our primary visibility. So let's right click, create a layer override. So for our layer, we want to turn this off. And now if we hit render, we should see that we just have the occlusion on the sign. So here's the render, and we only have our sign here. So this is great. We've got the mat set up correctly, and now we have the sign's occlusion separated from our ground. So now let's set up our ground occlusion layer. So to do this, we need to, of course, jump back to the channel box. So I'm going to hit Control A, and let's actually just duplicate this layer. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to copy the layer, So we'll get a new one, and so let's call this AO ground. And now for this layer, we want to, of course, select our ground plane, turn its primary visibility back on, and now we want to disable the sign's primary visibility. But as we can see, it's created with very many objects. So we can actually do this on the group level. So let's hit up until we get back to our sign group here. And now if we jump down to the mental ray tab here, we can override our derive from Maya. So let's right click, create a layer override, and let's underive it. So now we're setting this manually. So for visible, we can right click, create a layer override, and set this to no. So now it will be invisible for our scene. So let's hit render. And now we have just the occlusion that is being generated by the sign, but we don't have the sign actually in our scene. Now there's actually one more thing I would like to do to this. You're probably used to seeing occlusion passes in this, the environment is white and the occlusion is black. And that is completely correct. However, as you can see here, we've got this giant black area where we do not have any geometry. Now of course, we have an alpha channel, but I found that even with an alpha channel, we can get edge errors. So I would really prefer to have it be a uniform color and then have the occlusion be white. Now we'll see further why I prefer this inside of our compositing application. Now let's actually go in and make this change. So with our AO matte material selected, let's go to the out color, and let's just reverse our bright and dark. So let's pull our bright down to 0, and let's pull our dark up to white. Now of course that sort of reverses the usual knowledge, but if we re-render this, we now see that we have the perfect sort of scenario. Our environment is all a single color, and our ambient occlusion is the opposite color. Now, if you're sort of a handy compositor, you'll notice that we now have a perfect Luma matte for placing and using as a color correction tool. So instead of having it be black on white and us having to invert it, we now have all of our whitest information be where the occlusion is strongest. So again, this is kind of a different way of working, but I really prefer it while I'm in the compositing application because it means I don't have to do the extra step of always inverting my occlusion if I want to pull a matte. And of course, if you prefer working the other way, we could just invert this when we get into our compositing application. So now we have our two ambient occlusion layers set up. So again, we have one for the sign and one for the ground. And I really like dividing the ground and the background occlusion and shadowing from the foreground objects because it lets me go into my compositing application and really tweak them without having to worry about alpha, multiply issues, and edge issues. With just the pure AI or the ambient occlusion ground layer, we now have it completely separate from our sign, so there's no possible way for our sign to kind of mess up our ambient occlusion. Okay, so now that we have our two ambient occlusion passes created, let's come in the next lesson and do a very similar technique to create two different shadow layers.